All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of Networking Unlocked for the Azure Data Services. I'm happy that you have all thought also that networking is so exciting that you wanted to take the next 20 minutes to figure out how networking works for the different Azure Data Services. And since we only have 20 minutes to go today, I'm just going to jump straight to it. So if you think about Azure Data Services, whenever you create any kind of Azure Data Service, whether it's Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, storage, anything, you always end up with a public endpoint. You get that URL, for example, .database and so forth, and that gives you the unique name for your specific resource. But the fact is that you have a public endpoint. With Azure SQL, you actually have that public endpoint restricted from the get-go. We have some firewall settings in there. And those settings are there for all Azure Data Services, actually. We can find firewall settings in storage. We can find them in Cosmos DB and so forth, not just Azure SQL. But it differs per service whether those settings are completely closing off everything or actually opening everything up for the world. So not necessarily making it easier that these are set up in different ways in different services. And the fact is that it's nice to have this public endpoint and the firewall settings. You can have your users connect to this public endpoint and just allow their IP addresses to reach that endpoint. So simple and straightforward. Or you could also allow your application to be able to reach that endpoint and allow that in the firewall settings as well. But the fact might be that you don't actually want to have a public endpoint for your service, and that's really what we're going to be looking into today. How do you tackle that use case where you do not want to have your service out in the public internet and reachable, even when you have firewall settings in place? So I'm Heini Ilmarinen. I work as a DevOps consultant for a Finnish DevOps company called Polar Squad. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and also an MCT, so I run Azure trainings as well. I'm also a third of the Knee Deep in Tech podcast, and my favorite topics are specifically what I'm going to be talking about today. I get really excited about networking, identities, and topics like that, and really the architecture side of things. And my background is in the mathematics, so if anyone wants to chat about that after the session, I'm open to that as well. And as you might see, I'm a bit of a serial doodler. Pictures are how I process things and how I also explain them to others. So you'll see quite a bit of those in these slides. So we have this situation where we have our public endpoint for our service, and we want to secure that in our private network. How do we approach that? In Azure, we have two different options. We can go forward with private endpoints or service endpoints. And let's first figure out how are these two different, and how do you set them up differently, and what are the different use cases for these. So if we start with private endpoints, well, first of all, we have our data service, of course, whether it be Azure SQL or storage or any service that supports private endpoints. We then, of course, need our private network as well. So in Azure, that would be our virtual network. And on the virtual network side, we of course need to give it the address space that we want to use and divide it into some subnets, etc. But that is beyond the scope of this 20-minute session to go into detail. But in general, you need to have those in place. With private endpoints, what we're doing is that we are creating a private endpoint into the virtual network. And what that means is that we are creating a network interface card that gets a private IP address from the subnet that you specify for it. And then this private endpoint is linked to the specific service. And that's actually what is referred to when you might have come across this term private link as well. So the private link is actually referencing that link between the endpoint and the service in Azure that you're creating that connection with. So pretty much it's a separate resource. You get the networking interface card, you get the private IP address from the VNet, and then that is connected with your specific resource. note your specific resource. So it's to a single instance of Azure SQL, for example. On the other hand, if we look at service endpoints, again, we have the same starting point. We have our database service, and we have our virtual networks. But with service endpoints, what we do is that we actually create this service endpoint almost like a trust relationship between a subnet and a resource type. So, for example, we tell our subnet that, hey, you can communicate with Azure SQL. And that's it. And after that, we are able to configure in the firewall settings of this service what subnet are we allowing that traffic to come from. So there is kind of two different directions that we have to handle with these service endpoints. We are creating the service endpoint connection from the subnet to the service type, and then in your specific resource instance of, for example, Azure SQL, you tell that, hey, I will allow traffic from this particular subnet. So you can already hear that there is a bit of a difference to these two, but of course, then what does this mean on the practical side? How do we create these differently? So if we start with private endpoints. Sorry, my clicker. Private endpoints. So with private endpoints, you can find this flow in any of your resources that support private endpoints. You will find it in most cases. What is happening? You will find it in most cases under networking, or sometimes the networking is split into two, so you have networks and then private endpoints. But you will find this same flow for all those resources that support private endpoints. And essentially what you are doing is you are creating a separate resource. And so when we are going through the flow, you are, for example, specifying that, yes, this resource is in my tenant, or you could also connect to a resource in a separate tenant. You are giving the subscription from where you pull that resource. You are giving it the resource type. And here you can see it is the resource provider that we're specifying there. It is the Microsoft.SQL-server in this case. But you're also specifying the specific resource from that resource type. So we're not pointing to like all Azure SQL, but to a specific one. And then when you create this, you will actually get many resources in your resource group. You will get the private endpoint itself. You will get the network interface card. And if you choose to, you will also create a private DNS zone. And just briefly about the private DNS zones we're going to talk about in a moment. If we look at the service endpoint side, all right, it's working again. So here we go a little differently. If we, for example, take the Azure SQL Server as an example that we've been using here, and we go to the firewall and virtual networks, we can find a place where we can add a virtual network to those rules. But when we go and click there, we actually then find that it tells us that, hey, there's no service endpoint in this subnet that you want to allow to access this resource. So we can either go with the flow and let this actually create the service endpoint for us if we have the required permissions. It will totally do it for us. Or the other option for us would be to go back into our virtual network, choose our subnet that we want to connect this with, and then there is actually a massive list of different service endpoints that you can create there. And you can specify all of those different Azure services that you need to be able to connect to from your subnet specifically. So you can find them from there. And then you just click apply, and it will create those service endpoints for you. All right, so now we know what are the differences of private endpoints and service endpoints. We know how you create them on the top level. But what kind of implications does this actually have? What kind of scenarios does it support? So if we start with private endpoints, remember again, we have that private IP address in our subnet, in our virtual network. And that has a private IP address. So pretty much we can connect to that private IP address in many scenarios. First of all, we could have an application running in a separate subnet in that same VNet. And it could be an app service or a virtual machine that is running some kind of application. It doesn't really matter what it is that is running in there. But on the other hand, we are actually able to connect even from an app service or a VM that is in a separate VNet that is then peered to this VNet where we have this private endpoint, because we have that private IP address that we can connect to again. And the same thing goes here. Even if we have those end users that are connecting, for example, to that database using SQL Server Management Studio, as long as they're connected with a VPN or ExpressRoute to our virtual network in Azure, we are able to again get that connectivity to the private endpoint. And the one thing to note here is that with private endpoints, as we said in the beginning, when you create your Azure Data Service, you get that URL for your specific instance. And that is resolved normally through the public internet. And now, as we create a private endpoint, we get a private IP address for that URL instead. And actually, what now gets put into the public DNS is that, hey, this service is using private link. And it will try to forward it to this private link URL instead. So what we need to, in these cases where we are using the private or Azure services that are secured by private endpoint, we need to have some kind of DNS mechanism in place that will allow those names of the services to resolve to the private IP addresses that we got with these private endpoints. That would be another 20-minute topic in itself, but just know that you need to set up DNS in some way. If you're just working within Azure, then you are able to get very far with the private DNS zones. But if you have connectivity from on-premises and have a hybrid setup, those names need to be also resolved from the on-premise networks as well. All right. Then if we look at the service endpoint side in a similar manner, we remember that we have our database and we have our virtual network, and we have that service endpoint connectivity from a specific subnet to our specific service. And in our data service, we have allowed that subnet to communicate to that service. So actually now we have just a trust relationship between the specific subnet and the resource that we have. So we can have an application running in the same subnet that our Azure Data Service is in. So for example, in this case, we create the service endpoint in the subnet from where we want to communicate to that Azure Data Service. So what the implications of this are now that if we look at the similar scenarios we made possible with private endpoint, now, on the other hand, if we try to connect from on-premises, from our laptops, etc., that is not actually possible, because Azure is looking for the identity of the subnet from where the traffic is coming from when it is checking is the Azure SQL allowing or blocking the traffic. So that's not possible. But also, on the other hand, if we had a peered network and there an application running, again, that would not be able to connect to our database either. But the thing is that if we have some other service in another subnet, we can have a service endpoint from a separate subnet to this Azure service as well. So we can have these created to multiple directions. All right. So now we know how private endpoints work, and we know how service endpoints work, and we know what kind of scenarios they support. So how are you going to make the decision of which way to go? What is the correct approach for you? So definitely the first step is to check out the scenarios that you want, that we just walked through. Do you need connectivity from your own site over VPN? Do you need connectivity over peerings, etc.? The one thing to note with private endpoints, though, is that there's not currently a publicly available feature that we can use to limit what traffic can get to that private endpoint. If we have that private endpoint, then all linked networks can connect to that. But there is NSGs in public preview, I'm sorry, and that feature is coming. So then we are able to create NSG rules that, for example, allow traffic only from specific subnets in a VNet. Right now, it's still open from any peer networks, for example, that you might have connected, as long as they're able to resolve the names correctly. Then, so first, walk through the scenarios. What is it that you need? If you just want to limit the traffic from a single subnet, then the service endpoints would be the way to go. If you need wider, more broad capability to connect to your service, you will need the private endpoints. Then there is price, of course. Service endpoints are pretty much included in your networking costs, so it doesn't bring any extra cost to it. But private endpoints, on the other hand, do cost. There is a base monthly fee, and then you are paying per how much data is processed by that private endpoint. So keep that in mind. If you have a lot services, you will start to accumulate that price quite fast, I would say. And that does often come as a surprise, that it actually accumulates cost quite a bit. And especially if you're doing like massive analytics and there's a lot of data moving, that cost can hike up quite fast. Then you should, of course, consider not just the price aspect, but what is easier to manage. The private endpoint does require more setup because it is a separate resource, plus then you need to consider the DNS side. If you're just in a one Azure VNet, the private DNS zones help you out, and you don't have to do massive setup. But if it's a hybrid scenario, it is more management overhead that you need to take. The service endpoints are much lighter to set up. You just make the connection and you're ready to rock and roll. And then last bit is that there is a note in the service endpoint Microsoft documentation that states that their recommended approach to securing your network traffic is private endpoints. So there's no announcements yet or any kind of indications at this moment that service endpoints would actually be becoming redundant or anything like that. But do keep it in mind that it is possible that something like that were to happen. And then actually last point, that not all services support both. I was checking the current situation, and currently private endpoints support most data side services that I was able to check, and service endpoints have a little bit more limited availability to some services. So for example, for securing Azure Synapse Analytics, you have the most capabilities with private endpoints because then you can secure your workspace and your the data warehouse side with dedicated SQL pools, etc. Whereas with service endpoints, there's only support for the dedicated SQL pools side. So many things to consider and kind of plan that all out. What are your scenarios? What's the price gonna come up to? What is the correct scenario for you? Try to figure it out in your use case. All right. So I really hope this clarified the difference between private endpoints and service endpoints. It can get a little muddled once in a while since they are also by name very similar. Hope this clarified it for you, and you now have the tools that you can use to really choose the best option for you. I do want to ask you to leave any feedback that you might have for this session. Remember, you are also then entering yourself into winning some prizes. And there are also trees being donated then for every 10 feedbacks that we get. Thank you so much for joining. You can connect to me either on Twitter or LinkedIn, same name there as well. And thank you so much for joining. And if you have any questions, we can then cover those as well. Thank you. Anyone? All right. Oh, I see a hand. Yes. I'm going to...
Networks come into, seeing more of them come into things like Synapse, where you just check the box, manage. Where do they fit in the picture?
Yeah, good question. For example, in Synapse, there is a thing called managed endpoints, or managed private endpoints, and managed VNets. So they are based on these same concepts, the regular VNets and the regular private endpoints. But what has been done to them is that they have been made be less overhead for you. Exactly that aspect, that is one of the kind of downfalls compared to the service endpoints. So for example, if you have a managed VNet in Synapse, that is completely, you do not have to handle any of the subnetting or anything like that. And actually with that, you must use the managed private endpoints as well. So you cannot use the regular private endpoints. So they are a little bit more packaged, I would say.
So normal NSGs can't be used with private links to limit the access?
Yes, the question was that normal NSGs cannot be used to limit access to private endpoints, and currently, yes, that is the case. There is a public preview on NSG and UDR, so user-defined route support for the private endpoints. And so if you have any needs for that and really require it for your use case, which is, I think, quite often the case, it should be coming soon. That's kind of what I've been hearing, but there's no exact date being announced yet, so we'll see when that comes out. But you can test it out already. Yeah. Great.
Questions, we might just take them down the hall.
Yes, yeah. All right. Any other questions, you can just come up to me. I'm going to pack my things. Thank you, everyone.